Hello, my friend, wherever you may find yourself in space and time. My name is Morten. Welcome to Making Sense Of. And today we are going to try to make sense of CSS Container Queries, which is a new fancy thing for CSS, and also maybe answer some questions or doing some other stuff. I have some plans for maybe if no one has any questions to go online and see if we can find any questions worth answering. So that means if you are watching this live and you have a question, preferably related to CSS or web development in some way, by all means, ask it in the comments, and I will try to find an answer for you, either do a demo or find a link to something, or we'll try to make it work. Cool. All right. So today, I wanted to start off talking about CSS Container Queries. Now, CSS Container Queries are a whole new thing for CSS, and it's technology still in development, so it's not fully functional yet. That means what I'm about to show you works under a very specific circumstance in one browser currently, but this will become something that we all have available in the future. Which is why it's interesting. It's something that we will all be using. It is directly related to responsive web design, and it's very exciting. So I have a little demo that I want to show you, and I also have some caveats and things to keep in mind if you want to go down that route and play with it. So without further ado, let's take a look at what CSS Container Queries are. So it all starts here. On MDN, and this is one of those fun things about how the web evolves, because I was building an example of how CSS Container Queries worked a couple of weeks ago, and the example worked fine. And then in preparation for this live cast, I went back and tested the example and it didn't work anymore. And the reason is the spec, because it is still in development, has changed between when I originally wrote it, or when I originally wrote my example, and when it appeared. So the old code is now gone, a new spec is here. So what you're looking at here right now is the MDN read-only mode of the current updated version of the spec or the documentation, which was published this morning. So it's not even on MDN yet. I only got to this by going to the GitHub repo and then going to the preview of a PR that's been written. But this, what you're seeing here, is the current documentation for it. So the question is, what are container queries? Well, let me give you an example to get an idea of what this is. So here in my example, I have a box, a regular container. This is just the container wrapping around everything. And then I have some content. So I have a CSS grid here. There's a box of text, and then there's a component next to it on the right-hand side. Same thing down here. There's a box of text and a component on the right-hand side. Let's say I wanted to change the layout of this component so that if there is enough horizontal space, if there's enough width within the viewport, then I want the image to appear on the left-hand side and the text on the right-hand side. But I only want that to happen if there's enough space, right? Then the challenge is that these two containers here have different space in the layout. But let's see how we would do this the old way, right? So first of all, I have to put in the actual code to make it happen. So here I have some very basic CSS just to make that layout. So you can see what I'm doing is grabbing the component, the inner element within the component, and setting up a grid, and then setting two columns, and then setting a gap. And then I'm just setting the aspect ratio for the image so that it's square, right? I can do that, and now we get this layout here. So image on the left, text on the right, which is what I wanted. But you can see in the layout here that while it works on this box, because this box has enough horizontal width or inline width, it looks really weird on the top box here. So what I want is somehow to make it so that the container changes its shape, make a query that targets the container, not based on the width of the viewport, but based on the available width for the container. That's what container queries try to solve. Because you can imagine, like, if I went into this layout and I said, this box here looks wrong, I could go in and make a media query. So I could do like add media, screen and min with, I don't know, like, what is this? It's probably like 800 pixels. And then wrap all this stuff in, oops. Thank you, GitHub Copilot, for messing up my code. So I could do something like that and then say it's dependent on the viewport width, right? The problem with that is it's, maybe I need to do something less severe, like 600. So the problem with this is at a certain point, why is it not changing? What am I doing wrong here? Add media screen and min width 600 pixels. Let's see. Where are you? Component inner. Screen spell mistake. Skeen. Thank you. The benefits of having dyslexia while writing code is you get to write incorrect code all the time. Super cool. Thank you very much, Arvinder, for solving my problem. I would have never seen that, and we would have been stuck on this example forever. Okay, so here you see the problem, right? I can make it so that my layout changes, but it'll change on everything regardless of how much space is available, which is not ideal. So let's see what we can do with container queries. So container queries allow us to define a container using this property here, container type. And the container type property is the new thing I was talking about. So if you've read anything about container queries previously, so earlier this year, you would have seen that it says you take the container, so that would be the outermost parent container that defines the available width, and then you set the contain property to layout and then whatever direction you want to measure. That has now changed. So we are now working with container type instead, or you can do a container name or just container, but you notice that is container and container type, not contain. So that has changed. So what you do is you say, this container, the outermost container, or the one that defines the width of whatever you're working on, has a container type set to whatever size you want. So that can be either size, which is both inline and block direction. It can be inline size, meaning only the inline direction, or block size, meaning only the block size, and then you have a couple others, style and state, which we're not going to talk about. In most cases, you will want to use single axis containment, meaning you set up something like down here, sidebar container type, inline size. So that's what I'm going to do here. If I go to the HTML here, I made a bit of a contrived example just to make this all work. And the example looks like this. So we have a component that sits inside a div. Inside the component is this other div that's called component inner. And that's because I need to be able to apply styling to wrapping component. So like I said, it's a contrived example. What I'm trying to do is show you what this would look like if you were working, say, in React, and you built a component that you wanted to use in many different locations within a page, and you wanted to be able to control what the component, the layout of the component, depending on where it's positioned within the page and how much space is available to it. So I have two components. It's this one here, and then I have another one down here, and they are exactly the same. So what we want to do is measure the width or the inline size of the component container. And then we make a query to say, if the inline size of the component container is some specific value, then do something, otherwise do something else, right? So it's basically the same as a media query, except it's assigned to a specific container. Here's what that looks like. So first, we just nix our media query because we don't need it. And then up here, I already have the component, a component rule, but I'll make a new rule just to make it clear. So I'll say component, and then put in container type inline size. Now you'll notice VS Code does not like this. Unknown property is because it's brand new, like brand new. So it's not acknowledged, but you just have to trust me that this is going to work. So we say container type inline size. Once we say container type inline size, we're saying any child of this container can now be affected by it. So that means if we can make a query to say, hey, component container, what is your inline size, and then apply styling to any subsequent items, so any children of that container. That example is down here. So we use an add container query, and then we do what we normally do. We say min width something, right? And then within that, we set up the rule. So for this, we'll then say add container, and then min width, I have no idea, maybe 400 pixels. And when it's 400 pixels, then I want to apply this grid that we have already. So that means if the container is wide enough, so there's enough space, or the outermost element is 400 pixels, then we apply a grid to the internal content. Otherwise, we don't. And the idea then is one of the containers may then change its layout without the other one changing its layout at the same time. So let's see what that looks like. Actually, one note of caution here. To make this work, you need to enable a flag in Chrome. It only works in Chrome as far as I can tell. And to make it work, you need to go into Chrome. So you say Chrome://flags. And then you search for container queries, and you get this drop down here, and you say enabled. When you do that, you have to reboot Chrome because it has to be updated. But once you have, it'll actually work. So watch this. You see what happened? So the container query says, if the containing element, meaning the component, is 400 pixels or wider, then apply the grid. And look at that. The first element here, you can inspect it to see how wide it is. So let's see, it is this one here. The first element is 381.89 pixels wide. So the query does not meet the qualification there. But the other container down here is more than 400 pixels wide, so therefore it gets the grid layout. That's the purpose of container queries. It allows us to say, you, component, control your own layout based on whatever space you have available to you. And then we can change the layouts depending on the space, rather than to have just these global queries based on the viewport width, which is super powerful. You can imagine if you have a React component, or you have a Vue component, or anything else that you're working with, you can now assign layout queries to those individual components, and they will control their own layout based on the available space they are given. So you don't have to think, if I add this component here, I have to write extra CSS to make it conform to the available space because it has less space than over here. Instead, you just dump the components in, and then you can style them to say, when you have this much space, do this, otherwise do something else. And because this is just pure CSS, you can do whatever you want, right? All CSS applies. So this works exactly like your regular media queries, except it is now querying the outermost container of whatever component you have. There are a lot of really cool things here. Like, you could make a container query for the whole page if you wanted to, which doesn't really make much sense, but you could. And then you can have multiple nested container queries within it. And the key is the container query only applies to any element that is a child or a descendant of the container that's set to container type. So this is the thing that makes it all work. You grab an element and you say this container type is either inline size or block size or just size. And what you're telling the browser is measure the size, the specified size of this container, and then any child may be affected by that size using a container query. Super powerful. Is going to change responsive web design forever, probably to the point where we will almost stop using the media queries that we are now, because this is so much more granular. And it will also simplify our code dramatically, because we can now confine CSS to just specific elements and have the CSS just apply to the one element that we're working with. And for anyone who's working with components, this will be a huge, huge change that will open up doors to all sorts of new things that we just previously have not had. It's very cool. I think it's super awesome that we have it. And just from a CSS history perspective, we have been asking for a thing like this for as long as I can remember. Ever since responsive web design came on board, the immediate request was, oh, can we get this at like a component level? And the fact that it's now rolling out is amazing. It's going to take some time. Like I said, the spec is so draft that it's changing constantly, to the point where when I was making the example, my example broke and I had to update it. But it's slowly solidifying. It is now its own it's isolated thing. So before it was kind of combined with the contain property. Now it's become its own separate thing that is separate from everything else, which means hopefully development will move faster. And as you can see, massively powerful, very easy to work with, and just opens the door to amazingness. So I'm very excited about this, and you should totally go check it out. Go to MDN and look up the documentation. I'm assuming that this new documentation will be up very soon, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe sometime this week. If not, so I'll just show you. If you go to MDN Container Queries, you'll see this is the old documentation. So it says here, sidebar contain layout and line size. So this is no longer correct. But if you go down to the bottom and you say source on GitHub, then you can go to pull requests. And if you go to, let's see, where is it? This one here, partial rewrite of container queries doc for new draft spec by Rachel Andrew. If you open that PR, then you can go down here to the preview URL and you get to the new version, which is where you'll find the information you actually need to play around with this. So please do. It's super exciting. And as you can tell, I'm super excited about it. Sometime in the future, I will make a LinkedIn Learning course about this because it's definitely worth exploring in more detail. And there's so many possibilities baked into this that we just have not explored yet. So that's container queries. Let's see. Now, I'm like, I'll just organize an event without telling anyone and see if anyone drops in, and then I'll do Q&A. So that requires people actually having questions. If they don't, I have a backup idea that I need to set up. So bear with me. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. If not, then I will do something else. So I just need to log in somewhere and then get things going. Your questions can be on anything you want. Container queries, CSS in general, other things to do with whatever you want. I can see my thing here is lying to me. So it's like, I can see there are a lot of people on the video, but it says that there's 2 people, which is not true. So I might need to send a bug request or file a bug for StreamYard while I'm at it. So in lieu of any questions, wait, here we have something. Let's see. Let's see. What are you asking here? If it's still in development, we should only use it experimentally. Oh yeah, very much so. This is like, if you use it, there is a 100% guarantee that the person who visits whatever you built will not see it. 100%. Because activating that feature requires knowing about the feature and going into the browser settings and saying, hey, I want to activate this flagged feature. For a good reason. As you can see, it's wonky. The spec is not done yet and it's changing. So yeah, but you should. Like this is the thing about how the web is evolving. The way the web evolves is through what we call paving the cow paths, meaning someone has an idea of how to do something, and then people start using it, and then the standard will follow how people use it. So effectively, people walk along the path or make paths on the web, and then the browsers come and put paving stones down on the paths that are well established. So that means for us to be able to get features like this, we have to start using them and experimenting with them. And I'll show you one thing here, just to give you an idea. So let's see, where was my page? Here. Can I do this? So if you go to the container queries page on MDN and you scroll all the way to the bottom, it'll say here, share your feedback. This early stage of development is the perfect time to share your feedback on the specification. Specification author Miriam Suzanne is keeping a list of open questions. So from here, you can actually take part in the development of this feature. That means, number one, you can try it. find out if it breaks, and then if it breaks, go and contribute. Number two, you can build examples. So a very common thing to do is to go to CodePen and actually build examples of a feature so that you can test it and see how it works. And that's great for two reasons. One is you get to play around with it. Two is other people get to play around with it without having to write the code. And the third thing you can do is actually go into the project and start saying, hey, I have ideas about how this should work. I have a use case that I want to use it for, but the current spec doesn't work exactly the way I want to. All of that stuff is valuable information for the CSS working group that is working on it. And you can go and file issues. You see here, issues raised against the feature can be found on a project on CSS working group GitHub. So you can be part of the development of this feature by simply going to GitHub and either looking at the existing issues or filing new issues or creating examples or doing whatever you want. Your participation in this will drive the project forward. And that's why I talk about it here. That's why other people talk about it. If you go on YouTube, you'll find tons of people that have done live coding examples of this, precisely because getting the community involved, getting people to start working with this feature will drive the feature forward. So yeah, you should use it as an experimental thing, but not in production because it just won't work. Cool. Let's see, what do we have else here? This Ray Vigilobos person has a question. Since this is in flux, when should someone feel safe being able to use this? When it becomes a standard feature in a browser, which is not yet. So the best place to find information about that is to, is to go to Can I Use? Let me just bring that up so you can see it. So if you go to caniuse.com, you can look up any CSS feature, any HTML feature, any JavaScript feature, and see what the browser support is, right? So in this case, we are looking at this feature called container type, right? No, not this one. Let's see, where is it? Here, container type. So you would search for the property to see if the property has any support. So let's try that. We can go to Can I Use and say container type. Let's see. This is the text attribution timing API, which is not what we're talking about. And that's it. So that means current support is so lacking that it's not even documented on Can I Use yet, which makes sense because, like I said, this new property was introduced very recently. So it's not even documented on MDN yet, right? So there is no support. But in future, you'll be able to go to Can I Use and look up container type. And what you'll start seeing is something like this, right? So a good example of this would be grid. So people go, can I use grid? That's a standard question I hear all the time. This is what Can I Use looks like for grid. You can see the green across the line here. The only browsers who currently do not support grid are Opera Mini. Opera Mini appears on very common web-using devices like Game Boys and other very marginally used devices. So the percentage, the global use of Opera Mini, as you can see, is 1.15%. Another one is the Baidu Browser. That is actually a bigger problem than it looks like because the Baidu Browser is used in a lot of Chinese environments. And the reason why there's no global stats on it is because Chinese firewall, right? So that means if you're building something that is targeting a Chinese market and there's a high percentage of users that are using the Baidu browser, then it's not safe to use grid. But what you can also see is the global support for grid is 95.2%. And that's unprefixed. So anyone who says you shouldn't use grid yet, it's not ready, is wrong. And this applies to any CSS feature. So to answer Ray's question, when is container queries ready? Can I Use will tell you. So follow along with the MDN documentation. When the MDN documentation settles and the W3C decides on what this is actually going to look like in terms of code, then you can go to Can I Use and look it up and see what kind of support will come out. You will probably see Chrome coming first, then Firefox, then Safari and Edge. Well, Chrome and Edge will probably come at the same time because they're running off the same engine now. And then eventually we'll just see green across the board. Usually I start using things when the support is like 80%, 75%, somewhere around there. And generally speaking, in the modern web, support rolls out really quickly. So we don't have to wait forever for things to happen anymore, which is really cool, right? Thank you for that question. Okay, something completely different. how do you like GitHub Copilot? So for those of you who have been paying attention, which is probably not very many of you, since I rarely do these live streams where I actually do coding, way back several weeks ago, I did like a live thing with GitHub Copilot and just messed around with it. And it produced some interesting code. It did some really impressive stuff and some really bad stuff that just like it produced code that was useless to me. But it was an interesting experiment. Just to test it, I have enabled GitHub Copilot on everything I do, just to see, like, I'm writing code, I want to see what it does. And it is shockingly good at doing things. Let me give you an example of this. So let's see, what should I do here? If I punch up here, let me just punch up the project I'm working on right now. So you all know, like if you're working with VS Code, you know that if you make an HTML file, you can, at the very top, if you want the HTML boilerplate, you just go bang, and then you get an HTML boilerplate, right? Cool. The issue with the boilerplate is it never has the style sheet part in it, and I always forget what that looks like. So GitHub Copilot is on. You can see it down here. There's this little dude, Octocat with glasses on. So if I go down here and just hit enter, so I didn't do anything, I just hit return. And then it says, link rel style sheet href bootstrap.min.js. I believe Ray has been in my machine and tried to sabotage me. So then you can just hit tab and then go delete bootstrap because we don't need that shit. So we'll say style.css instead, right? Stuff like this is super useful. Also, if you are, you can see, Copilot will insist on giving you suggestions no matter what you do. So if you just hit enter, you'll always get a suggestion. And sometimes they're rather bizarre, but like, okay, so we're in the body element. What's the first thing you're going to do? A div container? I doubt it. But let's say we do header. And see, look, class header. What about class masthead? And then it closes it for me. And then I'll say div class container again. So apparently that's a good pattern that people use all the time. I don't really like it. So inside the header, what do we want? We want like an h1, right? And then actually, if we want an h1, we'll say about, because the document's file name is about, right? So therefore it's about. And what happens if I hit return now? What will be nav? Oh, sure, we'll do a nav. An order list makes sense. List item, oh, go to index.html. Go to about.html. What else? Go to contact, makes sense. And the UL makes sense. And the nav makes sense. You see what I mean? It's like, okay, we already have the header here. But it does a bunch of these things. And it takes a little time getting used to this idea that it'll suggest things that aren't necessarily what you want. But if you trust it, it'll try to help you. So you can do weird things, like you can write a comment and say, a function that takes this value and then outputs this value, and it'll actually write JavaScript for you and try to write JavaScript that does what you want. Or in the case of HTML, if you're doing something like building out a menu, like I just did, it'll very rapidly do that work for you. If I had a bunch of files in here, it would go look at the files and be like, I'll make an HTML or make a link for each of your files. So it's a really impressive piece of engineering. It's still very wonky. Like I said, it doesn't, like you saw, it doesn't always provide me with the suggestions I want, but it's easy enough to just eliminate it. I find it particularly useful when writing JavaScript, more than anything else, because it allows you to do things like document what you want to do first in a comment, and then it'll try to write the JavaScript for you, and it'll get close enough that you can modify that instead of doing something else. It also ensures that, like, if you start writing event listener, for instance, it'll start filling out your event listener for you so you don't forget to put things in it. The challenge with it is it's basing itself off of code from GitHub. So that means it'll sometimes, more often than I like, suggest very old code or old coding practices, right? Because it's not measuring for, is this common coding practice modern or is it the way we've done things for 10 years? And because the things we've done for 10 years may be more prevalent, then we get problems because it'll suggest old ways of doing things. So you have to be conscious that this AI is a dumb AI. It's just a machine suggesting things to you without really understanding what it's doing. And it's basing its assumptions on other people. So we hear about, people talk about bias in AI all the time. The frequent example in bias in AI are either facial recognition systems who are generally trained on people who look like me, who are white. So when facial recognition systems are exposed to people who have a darker skin color than me, the systems, number one, are very poor at recognizing people because they're not algorithmically tuned to recognize deeper or darker skin colors. But more importantly, the data sets that are training them generally skew towards people with darker skin color, leaning towards more criminality, which results in facial recognition systems that are, for example, used by law enforcement, have a tendency to over-adjust towards people of darker skin colors being criminals, right? So that is a type of algorithmic or AI bias that causes extreme harm. You have the same thing in GitHub, except it's writing code, right? So the code that it's writing will be biased towards whatever is the common way of writing code. So that means, like, for instance, you saw how I said nav, and then it automatically spit out a UL and then LIs, because that's the common way of writing a nav. There are other patterns on the web that are less great. Like, for instance, the first item in the page was a div with a class container. That's not good practice. That's not something we should be encouraging people to do. But it's something that a lot of people are, because you start by wrapping your page in a container, right? So it's helpful, but it also forces you to really consider, is this suggestion really what I need? Or is this based on biased data? And the bias in this case would be towards older code. So it's useful and not. I like it. I mean, it makes writing code easier. It is also super useful for someone like me who has dyslexia, because it's better at writing code than I am. I can't believe it, but I made a perfect example of what happens when you have dyslexia and writing code in the beginning of this chat, just for fun. So you can see how not only did I misspell something, but I had no idea I did it. And thankfully, someone saved me from my own mistake. Okay. Ray asks, is there some sort of fallback for this? We're talking about container queries. No, there are some JavaScript libraries that do similar things. Element queries have been around as a JavaScript library for a long time, but we're at that point in time where it's better to wait until the spec comes out than to try to backfill this. Because as we know, when you start backfilling this and then build it into an application, there's a high risk that the backfill does not match with the spec in the end, and then you'll be stuck with either having to rewrite your application or to try to shoehorn the new version in, and it'll just turn into a huge mess. So there are some JavaScript fallbacks that do similar things, but I would stay away from them. Okay. What do you think should happen to the min-width properties of a component when the container decreases its size responding to the media query's layout? What? What do you think should happen to the min-width properties of a component when the container decreases its size responding to the media query's layout? Oh, I think I understand what you're asking for. So do you mean, like, if the box is reduced, so the container that's being queried is reduced in width, what should happen to the min-width component? Well, you could nest queries inside, right? So you can have global media queries, and then you can have a container query, and then within the container query, you can have more queries. You can have container queries inside container queries all the way down if you want to. And you can change things like the min-width depending on, so you can change the behavior of the contents within any query to anything you want. That's why media queries are so cool, and why containers queries are so cool, that you're basically serving the browser additional code. And since the cascade just works on the cascade, anything that appears further down or is more specific will always take precedence. So you can actually change the behavior. And I don't want to say, like, I think this particular thing should happen. What I will say is these features like container queries allow us to be far more specific about what happens to components. And we also get freedom to actually do component level design in a way that we simply haven't been before, which is just astounding. Like the possibilities contained within container queries are mind-boggling. There's so many things we can do now, or will be able to do in the near future when this becomes part of the browser manifesto. So I'm super excited. And all of you who experiment with this will be part of the evolution of this. So that means if you think that something specific should be happening to the min-width properties when you do container queries, build an example, put it on CodePen, send it into the CSS working group, and see what they say. That's the best way to move stuff like this forward. Okay, another question. What do you think should happen to that's the same question. Never mind. Ray is promoting Bootstrap. He will get a letter of complaint later. Let's see. What do you think of other updates that are being prepared to respond to user preferences? So there's a bunch of really cool features that are coming for CSS now. And I think the key is a lot of this stuff is driven by user behavior and user need, users being us, the developers. So there's super interesting things that are coming that will dramatically change. I mean, there's some features that have been on the books forever, like environmental features. There's an API that I've seen demoed. I saw demoed many years ago that used the light sensor on your device. And then it would say, like, if you cover the light sensor as darker, it could switch between dark and light mode on a web page. So you can actually, in the web API, there would be a sensor input. And there's a bunch of these sensor inputs that are coming. A couple of years ago, we got the payment API. So there's a browser-level payment API that you can use to hook into so that there's safe data handling inside the browser. There's a bunch of these things that are coming. And the future of CSS is just super exciting. There's so much really interesting stuff happening. And it's, I feel like prior to CSS Grid, we would talk about features that may be coming to CSS at some point in the future, and it would take a very long time. The example of that is Flexbox, right? Like Flex got rolled out. It took 5 years from it first started to get rolled out until people actually started using it properly. Then CSS Grid came in, and there was this like title change in how browsers handled new features. So instead of going, oh, here's a feature, we're not gonna implement it anytime soon, it became like this other way of doing it where the browser were like chasing each other on who would implement it sooner. And that's what we're seeing now. So a lot of these new features are rolling out really, really rapidly. And they're also being put in our hands very rapidly. So for instance, container queries came to Chrome under a flag so early that the code itself that you use to build it is wrong. Right? It was rolled out so early that it was like an alpha version, and we're now somewhere near a beta version. But it's happening in public, so you can go and play around with it, which is just super cool. Okay. Let's see. Ray's having a chat. That's cool. Let's see. Is your new course on CSS ready for LinkedIn Learning? Which one? So I have a bunch of CSS courses either in production or coming up. The latest one that I've been working on is, I had a meeting today. That was the one where I was sitting, messing around with stuff on a table. So it'll probably come out, I don't know, sometime in the future, like a month or two, because I actually produced it early. But it'll come out. I have another course that's either in the pipeline or it just came out. I'm not even sure. Let's see. All right, I should share my screen so you can see what I'm doing. That would be nice, right? So if I go here, so if we go to LinkedIn Learning, this is not to say I'm not aware of what things are happening. It means I don't remember what courses are out yet because I have so much stuff going on. So CSS Tips is the last course. I have another course coming out that's called Controlling CSS Using JavaScript. Yeah, that's the one that's coming out maybe this week, very soon. I mean, I saw the beta for it the other day, so it is coming very shortly. It's a fairly advanced course on how to use JavaScript to manipulate CSS that goes way beyond just saying, oh, look at this, you can like change the classes. It goes into like how to pull a style sheet into JavaScript and operate on the individual style rules as properties. And there's all this really cool stuff you can do with CSS and JavaScript. So that's coming. It's not out yet, but it's coming very soon. I have another CSS course that I just handed in that will come out in probably 2 months, something like that. And I have a third one that I'm supposed to record in December or November. So that will come out sometime in the spring. And then in the spring, I have 2 more CSS courses that are coming out. So there's a lot of CSS on the way on LinkedIn Learning. It'll just it takes time. I mean, you know, I record it. I take forever to record things. And then it has to go through the whole process. And someone has to watch it and be sure that it's not nonsense. And then it has to be edited down and everything. But there's more coming. And I'll let you know when it comes out. Thanks for your answer. I will experiment and then I will tell you how it worked for me. Yes, please do. And not just tell me. Tell the CSS working group what you're doing and try to do experimentation in public to share it, because the more people share, the more people will start working on it and then things just roll. Okay, Andrew has a super interesting question. And this is a question I hope I can provide a much more comprehensive answer for in the future. I've sent out an invite to a person to come from the CSS working group to come talk to us about how CSS is made. Because the process of how CSS is created is super interesting. And it's also a little bit hard to wrap your head around until you actually get it explained to you. But the very oversimplistic answer to the question is, there is a group under the W3C. So the W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium that defines the specifications for the web. So HTML and CSS are defined by W3C. So if you want to know like how a feature should work, or what the specification for that feature is, you can go look at W3C. And then the browser implementers, so the people who build the browsers, go look at the spec from the W3C, and then they implement the spec in the browser. And that means there's often a disconnect between what exists on W3C spec and what is actually in the browser. So there's a lot of spec in W3C spec that isn't available anywhere. Like, especially if you go digging into SVGs, you'll notice that there's a lot of features for SVG that have been specified. Like, this is how it would work, but if you try in the browser, no browser supports it because it was just never supported. It was never implemented. So under the W3C, there is a CSS working group, or CSSWG. And the CSS working group are the people who develop the specifications, develop the tests for the specifications, and eventually roll them out. And that CSS working group comprises mainly people who work in browsers. So you have representatives from Edge and Chrome and Safari and Firefox and all of the different browsers. Then you have vendors, so you have like Microsoft and other companies, and then you have a couple of invited experts. So Rachel Andrew, who is the person who basically is responsible for CSS Grid, who, like, if you ever want to thank someone for CSS Grid existing on the web today, it's Rachel Andrew. And she at least used to be an invited expert. Maybe she's now working under some umbrella but she used to be an invited expert, meaning she's like the person who knows the most about this on the web, basically, and therefore she's in the CSS working group. So the CSSWG makes the spec and defines it and tests it and everything, and then it eventually gets ratified by the W3C and becomes part of the W3C spec. So there are human beings doing this. And all the people that are in the CSS working group are on like Twitter, they're on LinkedIn. You can actually contact them and ask them about things. They're super responsive. Like yesterday, when I discovered that the container queries thing wasn't working, I pinged Miriam Suzanne, who heads the specification for container queries on Twitter. And I'm like, hey, how come it's not working? And Miriam said, oh, it's because it's been updated. And I said, oh, but what's on MDN is wrong. Or it's the old way of doing it. So what do you want me to do? And Miriam was like, well, it needs to be updated. So I went and updated it. And then I submitted the update on GitHub. And then Rachel Andrew pinged me and was like, actually, I'm writing a full update to this. So instead of just like you're fixing 2 lines, I'll actually rewrite the whole damn document, which is why we're where we are today. But these people are public people who can talk to about CSS, right? Who are doing the work of moving CSS forward. And follow them on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and everywhere else, because you can see CSS evolving in real time, right? If you want to follow people who are deeply, deeply invested in this, let's see. We have Miriam Suzanne, Jen Simmons, Una Krevitz, Adam, what's his name? Adam Argyle, and the person who's under the handle CSS Wizard that I can't remember the name of. There's a whole bunch of them. There's a list somewhere too. So those are the people who make CSS. But key to this is CSS is developed based on how people use it. So that means technically we all are in charge of CSS. Those people just like look at the general behavior of the web and then they try to consolidate it into something meaningful, which is kind of crazy, but that's how open source works. That's how CSS works. When you screen share with us, I get a blurry output 90% of the time. It's a latency issue on your end. I doubt it. I think it is a compression issue within the system. And that I say that because I've also seen this happen sometimes. The good news is this is recorded, so you can go back and watch it later. So if you come back, let's say tomorrow, the compression has gone through and you'll get a much better quality version of it. You could also try to drop onto YouTube and see, because this is also cross-streaming on YouTube, and see if there's a difference between the two. I'm not sure. I've noticed this problem. It's a known issue. I'm not entirely sure what's happening. I mean, think about what's happening here. I am sitting in StreamYard, an online service that streams to LinkedIn, that puts this video into a frame and then feeds it to you, right? So there's so many bottlenecks in that system that who knows what's happening. Something is happening. But yeah, I'll definitely bring up that you said it, though, because last time I pointed it out, someone else was like, I don't believe you. So having someone else verify it is good. Okay. Display grid is not animated like with transitions like Flex. And if it did, how would I solve according to how it is located? So you in grid, you can animate grid lines. I think, I'm pretty sure you can change like grid line position using an animation. You cannot move things within the grid using any type of transition or animation. You have to keep in mind what grid is and what flex is, because when you start thinking about it in terms of what they actually do, it makes more sense that there's some things you can and some things you can't do. So Flex is a content out layout module. That means the content within the flexible box dictates the layout of the flexible box, right? And if you think about how you build a flexible box, it makes sense. Like you say, here's a container, it's flex, and then you get a flex direction, so you get items one after the other along the inline direction. If you want to change the width of the items within the flex box, you have to go to the items and set their width, and then you can set one item's width, and then the other one will flex to fill out the remaining space, right? So you get some weird thing like this happening. But it's the width of the individual items that dictates the layout of the flexible box. So the flex container can say things like align the items or wrap the items or whatever, but the actual sizing and positioning is dictated by the items themselves. Because of that, you can animate the features within the flexible box, because you're animating the individual items, and animating one item impacts the other items, right? So if you make one item bigger, the other ones get smaller to accommodate the available space. In grid, it's a layout in layout module. So you're saying, I'm defining a grid, and then I'm placing items within that grid. And that means if you try to animate an item inside the grid, that animation cannot affect anything else in the grid, because it shouldn't, right? It shouldn't do anything to the rest of the grid, because the grid is relatively rigid in this context. You were saying the grid controls the layout, and the items are placed on the grid. So that means you can only do things like transitions on the grid itself, like the grid lines or certain other features. But any type of advanced animation simply don't work within that context. And that's sort of one of the major differences between grid and flex, is that you have to think, am I imposing a layout onto these items? Or do I want the items to control the behavior of this container? And that's the demarcation line between grid and flex. So it's very much, what do I want these things to do? Which is not, usually it's very easy to answer that question. I want a specific layout, grid. I want the items to kind of flex and move around based on what's available, flex, right? But in some cases, it becomes really challenging because you may have a really nice grid layout, but you need to add an animation. Then you have to go to flex, or you can make a flex container inside a grid. So you can make a grid and then place a container, and that container is a flex container, and it contains whatever animation you want, right? Because these things are not mutually exclusive. They work together. Answer? I hope that was meaningful. I could mock up an example, but it would take more time than we have right now. Let's see, what else do we have? So what you're saying is that Flexbox is better for animation, eh? Yeah. Grid doesn't really have a lot of animation options. Flex does. So yeah, it's very much better. But you have to keep in mind, you have to first figure out what is this animation for. An animation, generally, you are moving away from the layout realm into the animation realm, and then both grid and flex might not be what you're looking for. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. And it's often better to figure out, like, what am I trying to do? What does that mean? What are the properties and features I need for that to happen? And then try to confine it to just the thing you're working with. We have a general tendency as humans to try to, we make decisions that are very global in scope when what we should be making are decisions that are super specific to just one element, right? So, and see, I wonder if there's like a troll button where I can mute one person in this chat. That's funny. I have, like, everyone thinks I'm this grid guy who just does grid all the time. To me, flow, flex, and grid are the same. They're part of a toolkit. Like, I have a hammer and a saw and a chisel in my toolkit, and they work together. You can use them together. The best uses of flex and grid and flow, or like floats and clears, is in combination with each other. Like, you may have a global grid on the page to make overall layouts. Then you may have flexible boxes to manage your menus. You may have flow within an article so that you can float in images or block quotes. You may even have a grid inside an article to manage like a featured image. You may have a flexible box inside a grid inside the article to manage like a gallery. These things are all part of a large layout toolkit, and you should be using them together. So yeah, I have no preference, but I will always have an opinion whenever I see a layout on whether or not you should be using grid or flex or float. It depends. So maybe I should do a whole thing on that, right? Just do a live event where people send me layouts, and then I'll say grid, grid, flex, flex, grid, grid. That would be super interesting. Anyway, it is 1:56, which means that we are almost out of time. So thank you all very much for joining me today. There were a lot of interesting questions. I really hope you take the time to check out Container Queries. Like I said, the documentation on MDN will hopefully be updated probably today or tomorrow or sometime this week. And until then, you can like dig down and find the GitHub repo and find the correct documentation. Container Queries are one of the most interesting and exciting things that is happening in CSS right now, and it's moving super fast. So we will be doing Container Queries very soon, and when we do, there will be a course on LinkedIn Learning, either by me or someone else, explaining how to use it in detail. Until next time, thank you all for watching. Thank you for all your comments. Thank you for your participation. We'll see you again sometime in the near future. Bye.